kill anybody, but nonetheless, you felt a little sting and you would think about it the next time.
They used to give out demerits, and I think you got a demerit if you went to the principal's office. But I declare, I never went to the principal's office. Never.
You're just too good, Ann. You're too
Well,
good.
I'm not that good. I just wasn't caught.
I raked a lot of pine needles off this campus, working off demerits. There was also a little block of like 10 words that all of them had like 20 letters in them, and you could choose to write those, sit up in the study hall and write those some amount of times. But a lot of us would, see if a faculty member needed a yard raked or whatever, and we'd go do that. That was the way I preferred to do it. Not that I had all that many, but there were times.
The flagpole that you see on the campus was used by the seniors to torture the freshmen. And they would take them out there, make them take their shoes off, and climb the flagpole. That was one of their pleasures, and one of the things that you ran from and hid from. And you always seemed to know when they were going to do this, and you always seemed to find a place to hide. But some unlucky guy would get caught, and out he would go, and up the flagpole he would go.
St. Gertrude's basically then, the teachers were nuns. And until my junior year at St. Gertrude's, they wore the full Benedictine habit, which is the long black dress and the coif and the veil. And they inspired respect, if not fear, and we were very careful. There were real rigid guidelines about what you wore and how you dressed, and you didn't wear eye makeup to school. People at St. Gertrude's, if they colored their hair, they were very, very subtle about it. Our skirt had to be a particular length.
We used to have to kneel on the ground to be sure that the
skirt had to touch the ground. And our cheerleading uniforms were supposed to be the same way. And
We'd roll them up after we got out of school.
Not all of us. Not all of us, but you had to be careful because it was St. Gertrude, and it was you didn't want to bring the nuns' wrath down, not at all.
Like a picture in a golden locket, there's a special place in our hearts for our high school sweetheart. As youngsters, we went to formal dances and drive-ins. We spent evenings at Shields Lake and Bocher's Dam because dating was one of the most important lessons of growing up.
One of the problems with dating was you had these long streetcar bus rides to go back and forth. My girlfriend, my present wife, lived in North Richmond, Barton Heights. I lived in South Richmond. It was a bus ride to downtown Richmond, a transfer at downtown Richmond to a streetcar to go where she lived in Northside. Once you got to their house, the only place to go was either to a movie, and generally speaking, go downtown to a movie. And you have to get on the streetcar again, go downtown, go back home, and come back. So, a lot of your time was traveling.
Before we dated, we would have to go to meet our girlfriend's parents, and they would ask your name and what you did, what your father's business was, and this and that and the other, before you were allowed to, take your date out. Then another thing, too, when you did take out, they expected you to be back at a certain time, and if you didn't, then you didn't come back the second time.
We didn't have any time for anything, and most of us worked as kids. And I used to jerk sodas. That's how I met my first girlfriends, because if they were cute, see, we made homemade Coca-Colas. I gave it a little extra squirt. And if it was a soda, got a little extra ice cream. Oh, yes, those were the good old days. And limeades. What is life without a limeade in the summertime? A fresh squeezed limeade.
I remember very well that you were always told, don't be ready when your day comes.
Yes.
Of course, you were ready. You were hanging
You
at the
look too
window watch,
eager.
but you look too eager.
Exactly.
Always let your mother or father open the door, and then you make your appearance.
I think that was all behind why I was never ready.
You know, we always double dated or triple dated or something. We were just very oriented to groups.
You know, and you never
Right.
hardly ever went by yourself just with a guy.
No.
No. And 'cause
Everybody went in groups.
Nobody was smooching or anything then. I mean, not that we didn't smooch, but I mean...
We had to be very creative about it.
Yeah. So we would all go to the drive-in. I mean, we'd drive in together, park beside each other, and everybody would get out and get your popcorn and talk a little bit, and then everybody, you might switch cars a little bit, but you know, everybody was watching you, so you weren't doing anything but holding hands and eating popcorn.
We came along a little before the sexual revolution,
Right.
you know, so, you know, we would just, I mean, you might have
friends.
a kiss or something, and, you know,
That was it.
whoa, I got a kiss, you know, but
That was it.
it was, yeah, it was a good time to come up.
We're the youngest baby boomers. We were the last part of the sort of the post-World War II society. It was all very old-fashioned, and you still had boarders who couldn't go off campus, and you know, as I said before, we were the last class to enjoy Tantilla Gardens. We had things back then that the children don't have today. We had a place to go, Tantilla, for public dances. You don't have public dances anymore. So it's, you know, it really is, it's a sweet memory, but it's sort of sad for today's time that the children don't have what we had back then.
I remember having a dance in the cafeteria at the town school. And then when we moved out to Country Day, the dances, the junior, senior got more and more elaborate. But it was really fun, and we used to get wonderful bands to play. And I think the boys were much more inclined to come as your date when they knew how good the band was.
Yeah.
And then when I started taking company, 11 o'clock, you had to get out. You had to leave. And don't you think you'd be in that living room long, because we had a stove you have to put wood in, and Mother or Daddy would walk in that living room 2 or 3 times while that fellow was in the living room to see what you were doing.
A parlor date was a date on premises, not only on premises, but you were in a parlor. You spent an hour or two in the parlor.
Sitting in the parlor.
And that was a date back then, and because the boarders were restricted from leaving the premises.
Then we even at St. Catherine's had, once you invited a boy, we had the card dance system, so you'd have to go around and arrange for your date to dance with certain girls at certain, you know, every other dance or something was a card dance thing. I don't think you hear about that anymore, no such thing.
Boys made a point of dating popular girls so that when they went to the dance, they knew they'd get a lot of breaks, because that was a custom in those days. You'd tap somebody on the shoulder, that means you break, and you didn't dance with the same girl the whole evening. That was a terrible experience if your girl didn't get any breaks and you had to dance with her the whole evening.
Driving around Bill's Barbecue out on Broad Street was where you hung out. And if you circled too many times, or if you slowed down, and of course there were just so many parking places, the police would come in and say, okay, move it on. But this was the big hangout after a football game. And something else we did, we had sock hops. And the reason we had sock hops was because you didn't want to ruin the floor of the gymnasium. So you took your shoes off, and they were, I mean, we always had sock hops on weekends. You didn't just date one person. You know, you maybe went with one person as a special date, but you danced with everybody.
And going steady was something that everyone aspired to. You know, if you could hold on to somebody long enough to go steady, you know, that was great. But you know, kids today do not do that.
When you went steady, the boys would give you their footballs or their basketballs their Key Club pins or their High-Y pins, or in the Cadet Corps, if you were pinned, you know, this was a big deal.
But when you got to the big time, you wore your boyfriend's ring that was huge, and you got a candle and melted wax into the top of it and filled it. In my case, my husband is 6'3" and has very large fingers, so, I mean, the thing sat up on my hand this big, all filled with wax to hold it on. And the bigger the ring, the better, you know, you thought you were great. And I lugged that thing around for a couple of years on my finger till I went to college. Then it wasn't cool to wear one anymore. I mean, that was strictly a high school thing.
All kids in the time when I grew up, and I suspect afterwards, and besides the dancing, and besides the roller skating, and besides those wonderful evenings at all these drive-in places, what about parking and sparking and smooching and all the petting and all the words we used to use? And we went to Bird Park, and we went to Bryan Park, and we went to Forest Hill Park, and we went to Bosher's Dam. And even there was a quarry over near where the Willow Oaks Country Club is today. And we'd go over there in the quarry. And of course, we were always on the lookout for the policeman who would shine his light and say, "What are you doing in there? Better move along a little bit now."
I don't know that the city children knew about Bosher's Dam, but everybody from West Ham did. But of course, it was right across the river, you know. You could ride across the old West Ham Bridge, and it had wooden planks, and you could hear it roll up behind you. In fact, in the summertime, I could count the cars that went across the West Ham Bridge from my bedroom in Hampton Gardens because the planks made that much noise. It did sound like the whole bridge was rolling up behind you.
There were, you know, certain levels of achievement that you might not want to get to until at least you'd been out with a guy 3 times.
Oh my Lord, I can't believe you're going there.
Where else is there to go?
Take it.
You know, there were some infamous places to spend time together. You know, Blue Shingles and Bird Park and. Come on, Mary, don't act like you don't know what I'm talking about.
Me?
The May Day celebration was one of the biggest events of our social year. It was prom night and the school carnival all rolled into one, and every young lady remembers herself as the belle of the ball in that very special dress.
May Day was one of the biggest events of the year at John Marshall. It was held on May 1st. There were princesses from each class, and the senior princesses had to run for May Queen, and I was lucky to have been chosen for May Queen my senior year. The gym classes put on a huge program with a different theme each year.
Getting in an automobile was unreal. You not only had the crinolines, you also had the hoop skirt underneath. and all these ruffles and everything, and you'd get in, and then you'd just have to drag the gown in after you, and then they'd slam the door on you, and the old hoop was sitting up, you know.
And what made it worse was the fact that you had on these crinolines, and there was no air conditioning. And it was, oh, they were hot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were. Mm-hmm. But we thought we were somebody with those dresses on with them. We thought we were Scarlett O'Hara.
The dresses were beautiful that the court wore, the beautiful colors, and I can remember my dress, my special dress, and that my mom had made for me for the day. I don't think we have any May Days now.
According to their former students, whether in the classroom or on the football field, there were no greater rivals than Armstrong High School and Maggie Walker High School. Since 1922, Armstrong has been educating students who are fiercely loyal to their alma mater. The first Armstrong High School was located at Lee and Prentice Streets, and the current school at 31st Street near 9 Mile Road opened in 1952. Generations of Armstrong Wildcats continue to sing their school's praises.
But to me, no school was like Armstrong. No school. Naturally, because that was my school. I walked 14 blocks every morning with my daddy's belt tied around my books because we didn't have book bags. And my mother liked to have a fit because I didn't live but 3 blocks from Maggie Walker. But I wanted to go to Armstrong because I had 2 close girlfriends and they were going to Armstrong. So I walked, regardless of the weather, 14 blocks to Armstrong High School on West Lee Street.
It was a pride thing to finish school, to go to school back then. I knew of no one that dropped out of school during my school days. I know of no one. And if they did, there was no one out there to hang with. So it was a pride thing to finish school and go beyond there if your means permitted it.
They all took a personal interest in each student. You were not ignored because you came from the railroad track or you came from South Side or the West End. Everybody, they had an invested interest in all of us. And it gave you kind of pride to say that, wow, I love these teachers. I'm going to be something. This was from the very beginning. You didn't have to look around and say, I've got to find myself. We were never lost.
Yvonne was talking about the teachers. Mary Jane Wingfield Payne was my role model because she respected you. She demanded respect, and she got respect. When you walked into her classroom, whether you wanted to study your lesson or have your homework or not, when you walked in there, you had it because she had the stature and the air about her that when you come across my dossier, wasn't any threats, wasn't any promises, but when you come across this dossier, you are going to learn. And when you leave out of here, you're already somebody, but you're going to be a more special somebody. And this is what I liked about her. And she inspired me to do many things that I have done in my life thus far.
And at that time, I was surprised when the teacher told us that we, the freshmen and sophomores, would come to school at 12 o'clock, and we would get out at 4. And the juniors and seniors would come at 8 o'clock, and they would leave at 12. The schools were so overcrowded that they had to have a double shift. But yet and still, despite that, we had some very, very dedicated teachers. And we didn't have a cafeteria. We really didn't need one because by the time you got up in the morning and had your breakfast and went home at 12, you were ready for lunch at home.
After school there was a store called St. James and Lee. And the fellas would go down to St. James and Lee, and sure, they stood on the corner, but they stood on the corner with dignity and pride. We would go into St. James and Lee and get club sandwiches and the milkshakes. Then we would leave and go home, and we would come back that night, and everybody would gather in St. James and Lee, and the booths could only fit 4 people, but we had 6 in the booth, 8 in the booth, because of that congeniality of coming together, the cohesiveness we had with each other, the respect we had for each other, and not only for ourselves, but for the person involved, the business.
I played on the Armstrong Wildcat football team as a starting linebacker and one of the smallest fellows on the team. I think at that time I weighed 156. But I had the heart of the tiger, of the wildcat.
The city lost a unique institution when Maggie Walker High School closed in 1979. The school opened at Lombardy and Lee Street in 1938 in the former Hartshorne College building. The school was crowded from the day it opened, but it always felt like family. Alumni from the school's 41 years continue to celebrate the Walker spirit, and the memories of their days as Green Dragons are still very much alive.
The way Richmond was defined, it was interesting because of segregation in terms of the majority races, white and black, but even within the race, it was very much central to where you lived. And the pride you even took in those areas where you lived. So if you lived in the West End, you were West Ender, North Side, South Side, East End. So South Side and East End primarily went to Armstrong. North Side and the West End attended Maggie Walker. And there was a lot of pride in going to those particular schools based on the areas in which you grew up. So those youngsters who might have grown up in the West End, where they attended Armstrong, well, you didn't quite know where to put them.
And as a child growing up, I couldn't wait to get into high school. I couldn't wait to get to Maggie Walker. And at that time, Maggie Walker was grades 10, 11, and 12. And I was at the middle school. They didn't call it middle, they called it junior high. I was at Benjamin A. Graves, which went 8th and 9th grade. And once we left, that 9th grade, we went to Maggie Walker, and we were sophomores in high school. We were sophomores. I just couldn't wait to get to Maggie Walker and be a part of the Green Dragon family.
Maggie Walker was important to me because she was my great-grandmother. But when you talk of the Walker spirit, if my great-grandmother's name was Armstrong, I would have gone to Walker. Yeah, I mean, it was not about my great-grandmother. It was about, this is the school that I am going to attend.
Now, of course, we talked about Magdalena Walker. We would so often say, not just Walker High School, Magdalena Walker High School. The whole thing. You remember that. There was nothing to compare to the Walker spirit. Absolutely nothing.
Our principal had a motto. You remember that? Mm-hmm. KWB. Keep Walker beautiful.
Beautiful, right.
And everybody said it. He said it to you, I don't know how many times a day, in the morning over the PA system, and in the afternoon before you left.
Right.
So you just heard it, and it just became a part of you, you know. And even when you weren't at school, you knew you were supposed to keep Walker beautiful. Those were good times. They really were good times. But that keep Walker beautiful was so strong. It was so strong. It meant, I remember when we established the first honor society organization in the school. See, when I first went there, there was no honor society. Don't forget now, that school was intended for vocational training. So as the school grew and changed, it became what we called a comprehensive, the first comprehensive high school in the city of Richmond.
Both rival school Armstrong and Maggie Walker had outstanding football programs led by dynamic and charismatic coaches. Armstrong was led by Coach Maxie Robinson, and Walker had Frederick T. Cannonball Cooper.
I lived about 10 blocks from Armstrong, and Mr. Robinson and my brothers and sisters had gone to Armstrong, so it was only, you know, it was natural that I was going to Armstrong. But I met Mr. Cooper, and I was just so enthused by him because he was a football player, professional football player, and with the Rebels, and he said, Turkey, that was his favorite word, come on to Walker and I'll make a star with you.
It was the greatest thing ever happened to me. I met a whole lot of good individuals, and they played ball for me, and they developed into something. Like the coach of Virginia State right now, and he came up as a player for me, and when I got down, he took over Maggie Walker for me, and then he was able to move over to Virginia State College. I have quite a few other people who have moved along just like that, and I feel I love that Maggie Walker.
So I go to Maggie Walker. My friend's angry because all of us were supposed to go to Armstrong. Mr. Robinson never saw me. He called my mother, where's Pierce? And she said he went to Walker. No, he said, no, that's impossible. I know he's coming to Armstrong. She said, no, he's at Maggie Walker. And from then on, you know, even though Mr. Robinson and I would sit there and play checkers, and he was as fierce a checker player because he meant to crush me, you know, and we would play chess, and he was serious about it. And, you know, I win sometime, and he'd look at me mad, angry, you know, but he was a coach, and he had to project a certain air, you know.
Every school has its favorite hangout. Green Dragons will remember the Silver Coach.
Oh, yes.
Oh, the bologna burger.
But the greasy
spoon. The greasy spoon.
The greasy spoon.
But the best thing that they sold were the bologna burgers. And we got a bologna burger every day before we ventured to walk home. And, you know, it was always fun walking home because we had a group of us that would always get the bologna burger and the French fries, and then we would walk past Union, and we would sing Union's alma mater because our parents had gone to Union, and we had been brought up near Union, on Union's campus, and all the games, the football games, the basketball games, and, you know, the sororities, fraternities, all the activities that they had there. So we all knew Union's alma mater, and as we stopped by there, we would sing their alma mater, and then we'd come walking home eating our greasy bologna burger and our French fries.
We wondered if they ever changed the grease.
And then when dinner time, when they called you for dinner, Mama, I'm really not hungry. Why?
We've had that bologna
That's
burger.
right.
When I left that school and went to another school to work, it was just like another whole world. There was so much that was missing that I had been so accustomed to. And people who had not experienced that same thing couldn't understand what I was talking about. They couldn't understand what I was feeling. Now, gradually there have been some changes to make more places different, you know? But at first,
My mother was a graduate of Armstrong. And my father was a graduate of Armstrong. And on our living room wall were 2 diplomas from Armstrong on the right wall. And on the left wall, there were 6 diplomas of her children from who graduated from Mag Walker. And she would always kid me and say, well, it takes that many for Mag Walker to equal, you know, the 2 that we have. But it was I mean, it was just something that you kind of live for. And, you know, you just live to just get in high school so that you could be a part of the Armstrong and Walker event.
People still talk about it. It was as much a part of the Thanksgiving tradition as candied yams, when arch rivals Walker and Armstrong went head-to-head on the football field. During the 1950s and 60s, the annual Armstrong-Walker Classic drew as many as 35,000 spectators to City Stadium for a high school football game, and a weekend that became a community homecoming tradition.
The Armstrong-Walker Classic, it was an event. It was something that the entire community lived for. People just could not wait until that Saturday after Thanksgiving to get all dressed up in their green and white, if they were if they were from Mag Walker, or get all dressed up in their orange and blue. It was a whole week. It was like homecoming. And in actuality, it was homecoming because it was Armstrong's homecoming and Mag Walker's homecoming, and we crowned the queens at halftime. I guess the halftime must have lasted about 25 minutes.
That game was different from all other games because that was your rival. That was your hometown. And you didn't want to go home and not celebrate that night. But over the years, Walker won more games against Armstrong than Armstrong against Walker. So they had some real tough teams back then. And Walker was a powerhouse. They were really good. They had some good individual players that I'll never forget. But just that day, to clash against them and them against us, it was a thrilling time for me. I'll never forget it.
Everybody was there. I mean, if you could walk or crawl, you were at the Armstrong Walker game. No, everybody was there. And if they were not there, they were glued to the radio, you know, listening to, you know, what was going on.
I can remember going away to college and coming back and friends coming home for Thanksgiving, and I said, we're going to the Armstrong Walker game, and they were like, well, you know, it's a high school game. And they were amazed. They actually called it, this must be a little Rose Bowl, because there were that many people in one stadium for a high school game.
For months ahead of time, you would start getting your outfits together because you had nothing on but green and white for us. And it was orange and blue for those other people. And I mean, your cars were decorated, everything was just completely done in your school colors. And it was bedlam.
The big pom-poms.
Yeah, the big
ribbons.
And the ribbons hanging off of them, that's right. And it was always that little thing of coming home, hoping that you could be the one that said, ha, 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 we won the game, and I wouldn't have to say, well, you just wait till next year.
But there were generations of kids who went through Armstrong who did not know the feeling of having won that football game, because those Walker Dragons just carried that ball up and down that field. I mean, it was great.
It's a tradition in the black neighborhood that when you go to an event, you have to be dressed appropriately. And so the downtowns, Tallheimers, the Miller and Rhodes, they profited because everyone wanted to get that special outfit, as they call it, to be at this Armstrong Walker game.
I've never seen so much orange and blue, green and white ribbon. I think the 5 and 10 cent stores downtown really sold out and got over. You know, there was orange and blue ribbons everywhere. green and white ribbons everywhere. And when the game was over, you still had it on, win or lose.
Right.
You know, you still carried on.
See, 50 years ago in Richmond, you couldn't find a pair of orange socks.
No.
I can see my sister and some of my friends dyeing their socks.
Yeah.
Orange, just to have the right color. Right. Orange and blue. You know, painting the shoes, you know.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the creative things they did to show off their colors.
Well, first of all, you've got to hear the just getting louder and louder, the voices, the whispers of the people. You know, the sound of voices. Sounds like when you're in Harlem, New York, and you can't hear anything but voices from everywhere. And then you can just see the people coming in. And when folks went to the Armstrong Walker game, they wore their finest. Folks even rented fur coats to wear those kinds of things. They even borrowed the best kinds of cars to ride up there in. And people from different sides would wear colors according to what school they were in favor of. If you won, of course, you teased. But it still didn't matter because we still hung out together the rest of the evening and just spent the whole weekend together. I can remember if the game was on Saturday, friends would come back in town and we would get together Thanksgiving Day, we would be together Friday, we would be together Saturday, and then say goodbye on Sunday evening.
People came back from out of state, from everywhere. And then 35,000 people was going to show up. And here you go. You know, you said, this is all I ever dreamt about. And then you had guys like Mr. Cooper who could make you run through a wall because he was just like Vince Lombardi.
But the worst thing that happened my junior year was that we lost. And that didn't happen often. And we lost my junior year, so that was only going to be one other opportunity to win, and that was the senior year. And I remember going through that off season, I'll call it that, from that junior year to that senior year, being very displeased with the color orange and blue, which was the Wildcats colors from Armstrong, and being very anxious at some point that next year after Thanksgiving on that Saturday to get back to the stadium, the city stadium, and have a chance to correct this thing that had happened the year before.
By the end of the 1970s, a restructured high school athletic system and the closing of Maggie Walker High School put an end to the Armstrong Walker Classic. The excitement may be gone, but for many, it will never be forgotten.
I'll be 80 years old, and I'll be able to tell you about the Armstrong Walker. I have somebody sitting around me, I'll be telling them about, those days back in 1964, 1965, those days when Willie Lanier played for Mag Walker, and we went 10-0, and the years from 1961 to 1970 when Cannonball Cooper was there. See, I remember all of that.
When Thomas Jefferson High School opened its doors in 1930, people expected great things from the city's newest school, and TJ soon became one of the state's top academic high schools. For many Richmonders, the Art Deco building at Grace and Malvern Streets is one of the city's architectural treasures. But for the former students of Thomas Jefferson High School, this school is the foundation on which they've built their lives.
TJ was a prestigious school from the day they opened the doors. They had fine teachers, and I really think they picked the creme de la creme to teach there. Now, I wouldn't swear to it, but that's my feeling, and of course, I'm not prejudiced much.
I really believe that my first impression of TJ remained my first impression. I think I never got over it. The size of TJ. Just this year, it was huge. However, and this I really appreciated and got to appreciate more and more as I went more and more places. The organization of that building was just phenomenal. And you always knew where you were. If you stopped being scared enough to think. Now, first of all, the first thing you do is panic. And after you've recovered from the panic, then you realize that the building really did make sense and everything was where it was supposed to be, even if you weren't where you were supposed to be. I did a lot of that.
It was the creme de la creme of high schools. And it had been under construction for some while. And everybody went to John Marshall. But then, when TJ was built, that was a whole nother story. You got on the bus with a lift to your head and a step. Exactly, that you felt very prestigious.
Some of my most lasting memories are from some of the teachers that I had. They were excellent teachers. There were some real characters among the teachers. Some of those that were the most feared were the ones that you really remember and you learned the most from. And so I really enjoyed the schoolwork because the teachers were so interesting and they kept us going. And by the time we got through and when I moved on to college, college was no problem because we had been so well prepared.
I think when we went in 1943, when we entered TJ, some of the teachers were very young. Because we were so young, we didn't realize how young they were. But after my children went to TJ and had the same teachers, then I realized how young they must have been when we were there, maybe in their 20s.
Within the TJ community, there was another community of students. They were boys and girls from the nearby Methodist home at Broad and Hamilton Streets. Many of the youngsters at the orphanage had lost their parents due to tuberculosis, once a common and deadly disease. Others waited for better economic times to come, when they might again be reunited with their families.
There was a tendency of the whole group was knit together pretty well. And then within the group there would be, depending on age, and going to school together, this type of thing, you kind of group together. But we were out somewhere to a movie or bowling, or going to school so far as that matters. And someone never gave one orphan a bad time. He gave the whole bunch a bad time. So we stuck together in that way.
I felt like anyone else. I was anxious to make new friends, and I didn't have any trouble. I felt we were out here. We were dressed well. No one could tell the difference because we swapped clothes all the time. We had quite a lot of outfits because someone else would want to use what we had, vice versa. So I just felt I didn't feel any different. I think for girls we want to look good, and I felt I looked good.
I can remember going to work on the farm. The children's home at that time, which was primarily an orphanage still, had a large farming program. I guess there were 25 or more cows. This was before the days of the milking machines, and we had to milk by hand. We would get up about 4:30 or 5 in the morning. We would have to milk the cows and then clean up the dairy barn, then come back to the cottage and get cleaned up before we'd go to breakfast. Then we would, after school, we would have to do the same routine, milk the cows and clean up the barn before dinner, which was usually served around 6 o'clock. One of the things that I wish that we had had more time to spend with school activities when I was in high school. All of us here, for the most part, went over to TJ. Back then, there were only 3 years in high school, just had 11 grades. We didn't have the 12th grade until after, at least I finished. I finished TJ in 1950. And I think it was the mid-50s or so when they started the 12th year. I don't think I went to a single dance, a formal dance or homecoming dance or anything like this when I was at TJ.
Could you dance?
No, but at least I would like to have gone.
Even though the years have changed its students, there's something about TJ that never seems to change.
it was fun. Even today, I go over to Thomas Jefferson to vote, and the smell of the halls brings back those great memories of the football players on the back field, bumping into students and just talking with them in the hall. And in those days, you had friends, your friends were from all over the city.
In later years, I have gone back there for seminars, and it was just like going home. Go into that auditorium and sit down in those seats, and you think, oh my soul, I was here 30 years ago, and it hasn't changed one iota.
Ask many of Richmond's residents where they went to school, and they'll tell you emphatically and with pride, the old John Marshall High School. From the first day of classes in 1909, the school had a solid, enduring quality about it. The massive classic revival building filled an entire city block between Marshall and Clay, 8th and 9th Streets. One man was synonymous with John Marshall High School. He was Mr. James C. Harwood, a strict but just disciplinarian who served as John Marshall's principal from the day the school opened until his retirement in 1946. The memories of those school days spent at Old John Marshall fill the pages of the Marshallite and the hearts of its students.
We came to John Marshall High School from different sections of the city, but from those particular sections, we all knew each other. When we came to John Marshall, it was a melting pot. So I think that's one of the reasons we were so close.
And it wasn't just me that loved John Marshall. All people, regardless of whether you lived in North Side, South Side, the East End, or the West End, once you went to John Marshall, you had that loyalty for that school the rest of your life.
You and everybody from Thomas Jefferson, we were talking about, I think, shoes. We used to get mad at Thomas Jefferson students because they changed shoes, and we changed cardboards in ours. We had holes in the soles of their shoes, so we changed cardboard while they changed pairs of shoes. So that gave us a real incentive. We try to do our best against them.
And that was another, I think, real strong point of John Marshall for the teachers.
They had an excellent teacher.
Excellent group of teachers. Excellent in not only their ability to teach, but their ability to handle students. I think that was a great asset for John Marshall High School. And people now will talk about the teachers that they had there, but they have forgotten teachers that they've had in college, but they remember the John Marshall ones.
First one that comes to mind for me is Miss Sidner. Yeah. She was a history teacher, as a matter of fact. Very strict, and just was wonderful at keeping your attention. You knew you better pay attention. There was no playing around. She was one of those teachers. And you listened to every word she said, and you learned.
When you were on the 3rd floor of John Marshall and you had a next class, say, on the 3rd floor of Wythe, and you had 3 minutes to get there, you had to move. And I did some up and down those steps and through the tunnel and up the other steps. It was fun, though.
Loyalty to the school, whether that been in high school, in those days junior high school, or even elementary school, was something that you don't find a whole lot of today. Because of many, many facets of people moving in and out and transferring from one location to another, you know, you don't have it. But in those days, of course, you're pretty well stuck to one school. So I think the loyalty of having been a graduate of John Marshall High School, the old John Marshall High School, as it was then, which was something that you were proud of.
John Marshall having a February graduating class and a June graduating class, you would have 2 cadet hops a year, 2 junior senior proms a year, And then you would have the sponsor parties after the sponsors' day. So there were a lot of parties and a lot of dances. The big dating was who you'd be going to the dance with.
We used to work on Mr. Harwood trying to get him to have girl cheerleaders, because all they had were boy cheerleaders. And it wasn't until after I left there they got girl cheerleaders.
And what I really remember that was really great fun, I think it was Friday mornings we would have a pep rally out in front of the school, old John Marshall. And the band would play and they would come marching in and playing all the fight tunes, and everyone would just have a really good time. And that would be before school in the morning, real early, about, I guess it was around 7 in the morning.
There was a lot to cheer about in 1940. That year, the JM football team made history under Coach Dick Eslick. The John Marshall Justices were undefeated, untied, and unscored upon.